beg your pardon, Luke chapter 16. You don't want to go backwards. Luke chapter 16. Take a moment to pray together. Eternal God, our Father, how privileged we are to be walking with your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, through this Gospel of Luke, hearing his words, feeling his touch, watching his actions. And as we open this holy book again today, we pray that we would be conscious of sitting at your feet, learning from you and being changed by you. For Jesus' sake, amen. Once upon a time, there lived a wealthy Christian lady who had a chauffeur by the name of Albert. Albert was a committed follower of Christ. And one day he died suddenly and went to heaven. St. Peter, later his employer died and also went to heaven. St. Peter met her at the pearly gates, welcomed her warmly, and asked her to follow him to the place prepared for her. As she followed, they passed a beautiful mansion set in spacious, well-manicured garden filled with magnificent trees, colorful flowers, and sparkling ponds. As she oohed and ahed, Peter said matter-of-factly, "That's Albert's place." Her heart skipped a beat, and she thought to herself, if Albert has a place like that, I can't wait to see my place. It'll be beyond my wildest dreams. But as they walked on, the streets grew narrower and the homes smaller. Eventually, Peter stopped outside a little semi-detached place. The front door opened onto the pavement. There was no garden at the front. The home was painted a dull grey. Peter opened the door and indicated that this was her place. She was shattered. "Why?" she questioned. "Why does Albert have such a beautiful mansion? Why I only have this?" Peter replied, "Well, you see, Albert has been sending up materials for the building of his mansion all along. This is all we could build with what you sent up." Oh, that humorous little story illustrates a biblical principle that the way we use our wealth in this life, our material wealth in this life, has eternal consequences and is therefore a very serious matter. And during Jesus' earthly ministry, he spoke quite a lot about money and about the disciples' responsibility in relation to it. And in this interesting passage that's before us this morning, this is another of Jesus' teachings on the subject of the wise use of money. But before we dip into it, we just need to be reminded of the context in which we find this in the Gospel of Luke. Why is it here? You remember last Sunday we looked at 3 parables in Luke chapter 15, the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the parable of the 2 lost sons. And you remember that Jesus' telling of those parables was prompted by the Pharisees grumbling that Jesus was welcoming and nochal eating with the poor and the people who were just not considered worthy by the Pharisees. And he showed in those parables that God's heart is for lost people. God is searching for lost people. Jesus is searching for lost people to bring them into his kingdom. He invites them to his banquet, the wonderful parable back in chapter 14. That's the heart of God, wanting for people to come to him. And when people repent, what happens? There is rejoicing in the presence of the angels. Jesus said, over one sinner that repents, more than over 99 righteous people who think they're righteous, who think they don't need to repent. So those parables show God's heart, God's agenda, God's passion. Now, the parable of the shrewd but dishonest manager that we're about to explore is part of this set of parables that began in chapter 14 and carries on through. And the goal of this parable is to encourage Jesus' disciples to use their material resources in line with God's heart as it's revealed in those three parables in Luke 15. So let's dip into chapter 16. Let me read from verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, so now he's talking to his disciples. If you're a disciple of Jesus, he's talking. The Pharisees are present, as we'll see when we get to the end of this. The Pharisees are present, but Jesus is talking to his disciples. And here is the parable. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig or do manual labor, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. We'll just stop there. We'll carry on a little later on. So we're going to explore this parable under two simple headings. We're going to look at the parable about money, and then we're going to look at 5 principles about money that emerge from the parable. So start off with the parable about money. This parable is known, and if you have a Bible that has headings, a translation that has headings, the heading may read, "The Parable of the Shrewd Manager." I've called him the shrewd dude, because that's what he was. And as the story opens, as the parable opens, we're immediately introduced to this estate manager who had a serious problem. Verses 1 to 3. Again, Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg." I mean, talk about a serious problem. The guy had been fired for mismanagement and incompetence, and he had to get the books in order before handing them over to his successor. And he realized that he was in a predicament. What was he going to do about his future? It says he was not strong enough to dig, and maybe that means he was old. I don't know. And he didn't want to particularly be standing at the robots with a sign asking for money, begging. And so what on earth is he going to do? And this guy may not have had the best ethics in the world, but he wasn't dumb. And so he came up with a very, very shrewd plan. Verses 4 to 7, you see the idea dawning on him in verse 4. Look at the text. He says, I know what I'll do. So here's his serious predicament. And as he mulls it over, and all of a sudden it's kind of, the penny drops. Eureka, I know what I'll do. So that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into the houses. So he has kind of an aha moment. He comes up with this shrewd plan. And so he calls his master's debtors. He knows people who had been renting this landowner's land. One obviously was using it to grow olive trees and to get olive oil. The other part of the land was rented out to a farmer who was growing wheat. And there was the understanding that the owner of the land would receive a certain percentage of the harvest, a certain proportion. And so it was all done and dusted. It was all agreed upon. And so this guy thinks, aha, I know what I'll do. So he calls the guy in who owes him, when at harvest time would owe him all that oil. And the other guy who at the harvest of wheat would owe him a ton of wheat. And so he engages with him, and he changes the books and drops the amount that they owe considerably. I'm not going to take the time to go into how much. You can Google that and find out. It wasn't inconsiderable. And so he just helps them out by dropping the cost, the amount that they owe. And of course, they probably realized that maybe something fishy was going on here. Maybe they thought that he had permission to do it. But even if he didn't, they were happy because they were scoring. So they kind of go along with it, and they loved him for it. And so it was a very, very shrewd plan. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us how the master found out what his manager had done. But you can imagine. It was good to use a little bit of sanctified imagination when you are studying the scriptures. So let's imagine he was just popped into Woolies to grab a few things, and he meets one of his debtors, and the guy just grabs him and pumps his hand and says, man, thank you so much for reducing my debt. I really, really appreciate it. Gives him a big hug, and the guy's a bit nonplussed, but he gets to his car and his phone beeps, and he looks at a message, and it's a message from another one of his the people who owed him stuff, and he's so thankful and full of praise for him. And then he begins to realize, wow, these people love me because of what I've done. But then he realizes, So he goes home, and he's ready to strangle his manager, but at the same time, he finds that because the word is out that he's so generous and so kind and has been so gracious in reducing the amount that he was owed, he's sort of caught in the middle. And so he kind of says, well, I guess I just have to live with it. But on the one hand, he wants to strangle the manager, but on the other hand, he gives him some strange praise. Look at verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. He must have thought to himself, what a clever crook. And it was strange praise, and at first glance it is strange praise. He praised him specifically for his shrewdness in the way he had come up with that plan and executed that plan and put his master in a corner where he couldn't back down and had to live with what the guy had done. And in a way, we sort of do that. I thought this recently when I read on the news or heard on the news about the recent robbery at the Louvre Museum in Paris. And I read about how these guys had got a vehicle with a long ladder, and they had managed to get it into place, and they climbed up the ladder, got in, stole millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of priceless jewels, and managed to get out and get onto scooters and disappear into Paris traffic. And I thought, yeah, they are so clever to have pulled that off. You know, if you've been following the news, they weren't clever enough because they've been caught. But I mean, it was a pretty clever plan that they came up with to figure that out. You can't, you know, they were dishonest, but they were shrewd and clever. Or you read about some 15-year-old Chinese kid who's sitting in some little apartment in Shanghai, hacks into the computer system at the Pentagon. And you think, was that right? No. But was he clever? Flippy was clever. So that's the kind of thing we've got here. And so his master praised him, not because he'd been crooked, but because he'd been clever. So that's the parable about money. Now let's look at 5 principles about money. And the principles Jesus teaches in verses 8 to 13 must shape our thinking and our acting when it comes to material possessions. And that applies to us whether we happen to be wealthy or somewhere in the middle or poor. There are no footnotes that says this only applies to you if you earn in excess of so much per annum. This applies to disciples of Jesus. The amounts will differ, the sums will be different, but the principles apply to all who claim to be followers of the Lord Jesus. So let's read together from verse 8 again. The master commended the dishonest manager because he'd acted shrewdly. Now there's that word, beautiful word for. Now Jesus is taking this story and he's applying it. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So 5 principles. Number 1, all we possess belongs to God. And this principle is taught in verse 12 and is illustrated in the parable we've just looked at. Look at verse 12. If you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So the very simple principle is that all we possess belongs to God. Everything you have is someone else's property. So what does that mean? If you have a house, it's God's house. If you have a car, it's God's car. If you have clothes, they're God's clothes. If you have money, it's God's money. We're stewards of somebody else's property. This is such an important principle. All I am and all I have belongs to him. In the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, it says, remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And you might have worked very hard and very long and very wisely for the wealth that you have. But at the end of the day, never forget that the ability to produce wealth is a gift of God. I mentioned before that a verse that has been one of the most formative in shaping my thinking is John 3:27, the words of John the Baptist. A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given from heaven. Even one thing, unless it is given from heaven. So we need to be conscious of something. Let me ask you, how conscious are you? Are you aware? Did you know? Maybe you're hearing this for the first time. Are you aware that everything you are and everything you have comes from God and ultimately belongs to God? Principle number 2, we have authority to use the wealth God has entrusted to us. Verses 9 to 12. And this principle is taught again in these verses, 9 to 12, and illustrated in the parable. Look at verse 9. Verse 9 speaks about using worldly wealth. Verse 11 refers to handling worldly wealth. And verse 12 indicates that we have a responsibility to use someone else's property, just as the manager in the parable had responsibility for his master's property. And so, as stewards of what the Lord has given us, we have authority. You choose what you do with your stuff. You choose. He's given it to us, but he said, you make the decisions as to how you spend it, how you save it, how you give it, what you do with it. We have that authority, and the Lord has entrusted it to us. And that, in a way, should fill us with a certain sense of awe and maybe even the right kind of fear. Because when you know that what I've got, whether it's my gifts and abilities, my health, my money, my job, when you realize that this actually belongs to God, it'll make you think of it differently and treat it differently and make decisions differently. So don't forget that. And then we are responsible for the wise use of our worldly wealth. And verses 8b to 12, after concluding the parable, Jesus says, look at the second part of verse 8, for the people of this world, he has just commended this shrewd manager for his shrewdness. And then he goes on and he says, for the people of this world, there he's referring to unbelievers, to those who do not know the Lord, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind, other people of the world, than are the people of the light. Jesus is not saying that we should become worldly minded, but he is saying the obvious thing that when it comes to the handling of wealth, sometimes as Christians, we need to learn from the unsaved who manage their wealth wisely. They do it for themselves, for their own reasons. They think it's theirs. They think it's they've earned it. They deserve it. They have no sense of God in it. But they are careful and they're wise and they're strategic and they think ahead and they plan and they invest. And so Jesus is saying we need to take, in a sense, take a leaf out of their book and learn. Don't be a stupid Christian, but be a shrewd Christian. That's what he is saying to us. The people of the world have a worldly perspective, but the people of light, as he calls his disciples have a different perspective. But often we fail to live up to that perspective, don't we? We can very easily be just worldly in the way we handle material things. We can be no different to the world. We can have the same values, the same spending habits, the same materialistic outlook as those who don't know God. And he says, Jesus says, no, we should be different. We should be clever, but with an eternal perspective in our cleverness. So this manager was not commended for his dishonesty, but for his shrewdness, his astuteness, his wisdom, and that's what we need to strive for. And then principle number 4, wise management of our, in quotes, our wealth will result in eternal blessing to others and to ourselves. Look at the text again from verses 8 and 9. Jesus says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. Verse 9, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that, here's the purpose statement coming up, so that when your worldly wealth is gone and when your life is over, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And I think that verse 9 is the main point of this parable. By means of the wise use of his master's goods that had been entrusted to him, the manager in this parable made friends who would, when he was in need and homeless and jobless, welcome him into their homes. And that's the illustration that Jesus is using to teach us this important lesson. The point of the parable is that Jesus wants his people, the children of light, to look ahead and into eternity, and by means of our worldly wealth, the wealth he's entrusted to us, to support gospel causes and needy people, so that one day when we die and we enter into the eternal dwellings, there will be people there to meet us and welcome us, and they will have benefited by our ministry, by our service, by our giving. Let me give you some illustrations of how this works. I'm holding in my hand a New Testament in the Makonde language of northern Mozambique. 25 years ago, a couple from the UK, Benji and Rhoda Leach, graduates of either Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember which. He was a geologist. She was a London barrister. Sensed the call of God to missions. They studied linguistics. They learned Portuguese, which is the trade language of Mozambique. And then they made their way to the northern border of Mozambique and settled in the Makonde, amongst the Makonde people who had no Bible in their own language. And then they had to learn the Makonde language. And then they had to work on translating the New Testament into that language. Irene and I got to know them and another group, and a group of probably a dozen couples who were doing a similar thing in different parts across the north of Mozambique, and one couple in Botswana. And we spent many, many times with them. We would meet in Harare during the war years in Mozambique when it wasn't safe to meet in Mozambique. And then after the war in Mozambique ended, they built a big linguistic center in Nampula in northern Mozambique, and we'd go up there and spend a week with them, just becoming a pastor to them and teaching the Bible and counseling. And they became our friends. And yesterday afternoon, I visited Benji Leach in Mill Park Hospital, critically ill, just had major brain surgery, the second time. And I stood at his bedside. His wife was on the one side. His son, who we knew when he was a little boy, now a pastor in London. And he just came out of a coma he'd been in for a few days following this surgery and some other complications. And we prayed together. And a young dietitian who I happen to know, she came and introduced us, and she said, "Wow, Pastor Leigh, what are you doing here?" And she's his dietitian. And we just put our arms around each other and gathered around his bed and prayed. 25 years. I was up there in that area when they had the dedication. The whole town turned out. They opened up the container and brought out these boxes of New Testaments. Thousands of them. People lined up all the way through the center of town to get this book into their hands for the first time. It was wonderful. And today, in that area of Mozambique, they're facing horrendous persecution. The Al-Shabaab Islamic terrorist group is killing people. There were recently 30 people beheaded in that area. And yet they're getting ready now to do the second printing of this New Testament. But the point of this parable is that behind this are hundreds of people in their home church in London and other places who for 25 years have prayed for them and supported them, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, some who were able to give a little bit of money, some who were able to give a lot of money. They could not have done this had it not been for the people who have supported them through all of these years. And when those people, those nameless people who are part of a couple of churches in London that they're part of and others, when they go to heaven, there will be Makondi people there who will be saying, "Welcome, because you supported the Leaches. We got the Bible and we came to know Christ." This is the Amato New Testament, done by another one of those couples, John and Susan Eisenmenger. She's Canadian, he's American. He grew up in a little Midwestern or little town in Pennsylvania. Same story, called by God. He was in the U.S. Navy, called by God into missions. Learned Portuguese, learned the Amato language, spent 25 years, and they had the dedication of this. We weren't able to go. They had it during COVID, which was really unfortunate. But he sent this note to the people who'd supported them when the dedication happened. He said, "I wanted so much for you to be there, and thank you personally for your steadfast commitment to this work for so many years, nay, decades. On the dedication day, we sold 3,000 copies of the Amato New Testament. Each print copy was accompanied by an audio on a micro SD card. In the following week, another 2,000 copies were sold. And he reminded us that when they first went there 25 years before, one of the church leaders had said, they've come here, and their being here is not going to be like a mealie that you plant and you see it come up quickly. They planted a palm tree right in the village, and he said their being here is going to take long to grow like a palm tree. And he said, yes, 25 years later at the dedication, they stood under that palm tree and they marveled at what God had done. But again, there are people in little towns in the western United States and in and around Toronto in Canada who have supported this couple. Thousands of people behind this book, thousands of prayers behind this book. That's the principle that has been taught here. Let's bring it closer to home. You're rushing out of Pick and Pay at the till, and you pull out a little gospel booklet, and you thank the person who's packing your groceries, and you say, this is a little booklet about Jesus. I'd love you to read it. Thank you so much for serving me today. And you walk away, and you never see them again. You wouldn't recognize them if you passed them in the street. But one day on the streets of heaven, that little lady is going to walk up to you and say, hey, you gave me that booklet, and I heard about Jesus, and I trusted him, and it changed my life. Well, the car guard that I gave one to as I left the hospital yesterday, gave him one of these and a handful of sweets. I always have a big ice cream bucket of sweets in the car. So he's have a tract and have a handful of sweets. He says, goodbye, my dollar. I want to turn around and hit him. My dollar. I mean, we did the same thing. Some of you don't have a lot of money, but you gave 25 rand, the cost of a hamburger, which provides a New Testament that'll land up in the home, in the hands and in the home of someone in Turkey, a Turkish Muslim. And it'll be a great day when you meet them on the streets of heaven and they say, you sacrificed that hamburger so that I could have a New Testament and my whole family came to Christ. We became, see, that's what this is about, you know. Well, you boiled up a couple of dozen eggs and brought them to Saturday church. You took that money out of your pocket and bought the eggs and boiled them and brought them here. And you'll meet some guy up there who says, I came for the food. But I heard the message of Jesus and I came to know him. That's the whole point of this story, of this parable. And so let's get down to making it uncomfortable. One more principle. The last one. Verse 13, our attitude toward material things reveals who our true master is. Look at the text, verse 13. No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. How do I know? How do you know who your master is? If I'm giving faithfully and generously, that is a sign that God is your master. The way I use my money is a pretty accurate barometer of the state of my relationship with God. And again, it's not about the amount. I'm thankful that as a young Christian, when I came to Christ at the age of 9, I was taught that every 10 rand I got R1 belonged to God. That was a principle. You can get into discussion about tithing in the New Testament or whatever, but that's a basic principle. And so it's not, well, when I get my first job and when I'm rich. No, it's everything we receive. Some of it needs to go to Him. And so let's apply that. Put up that last slide if you would. Lord, what do you want me to do? When I listen to a parable like this and the principles that emerge from it, maybe your action is to start giving. Maybe you have not been in the habit of giving to the Lord for the spreading of the gospel, for the reaching of lost people. Maybe you've never done it. Maybe you've never heard that it's your responsibility. So you can start. So the next time you get 10 rand, give R1 for the Lord's work, for the spreading of the gospel. And then start giving regularly and joyfully. Some people give sporadically and unhappily. But start giving regularly and joyfully. Those are the principles that are taught in 2 Corinthians. Maybe you need to up your giving. Maybe you are giving. Maybe you're giving faithfully, joyfully. But maybe you can do more. Again, keeping the eternity. Remember, there was one of the old Puritans who prayed, Lord, stamp eternity on my eyeballs, so I look at life with an eternal perspective. It doesn't say you have to only give 10%. You can give 20, 30, 40, 50, 90. And then maybe you need to alter your lifestyle. That sometimes is the way to give more. And there are many ways you can do that. There's things you can cut back. There are things you can sell. There are things you can get rid of. The things you would want to do that you decide you're not going to do that, but instead invest it in gospel causes. And then maybe you need to change your will. That's a thought. To put in your will. When you die, it's not all going to go to your kids. I told my kids, when I die, you're not going to get it all. Because in our will, we have stipulated a missionary cause in Thailand that's part of whatever our estate is. I hope I don't follow my mum's example. When she died, she had 14 rand in her bank account. And my sister and I each got 7. But couldn't even buy a hamburger with that. So think about it. I mean, we have an education fund in the church, and that has enabled us and is still enabling us to support students who are preparing for Christian ministry. That education fund existed because somebody put in their will, when we die, we want this to be set aside for that. And it was hundreds of thousands of rand. And it has been administered by the leaders of the church since then. So don't just give it all to your kids and let them go on a holiday with it. Invest it so that when you step onto the eternal shore, there will be people there who will say, welcome. What you did resulted in me hearing the gospel and me being here. That is the point of the parable. I'm going to ask the worship team to come, and we're not going to sing. You're going to sit and listen, and they're going to share with us a song that really ties in with this. You may have heard it, you may know it, and if you want to sing along, you're welcome to do it. But just a reminder that you can be welcomed into eternal dwellings by those who are there because of your faithful stewardship.
dreamed I went to heaven. You were there with me. We walked upon the streets of gold beside the crystal sea. We heard the angels singing, and someone called your name. Turned and saw this young man. He was smiling as he came. He said, "Friend, you may not know me now." Then he said, "Away. You used to teach my Sunday school when I was only 8. And every week you would say a prayer before the class would start. And one day when you said that prayer, I asked Jesus in my heart. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am a life that was changed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am so glad you gave. And another man stood before you. He said, "Remember the time a missionary came to your church. His picture made you cry. You didn't have much money, but you gave it anyway. Jesus took that gift you gave. That's why I'm here today." One by one they came, far as the eye could see. Each life somehow changed by your generosity.